Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this special conversation presented by the Catholic Art Institute. Today, we're delighted to welcome two remarkable guests for a discussion on Flannery O'Connor and her prayer journal, a work of profound honesty, spiritual depth, and artistic insight that continues to resonate deeply with writers, artists, and everyone seeking to live a life ordered towards truth and grace. We're especially pleased to have with us Dr. Barbara Nicolosi, screenwriter, producer, founder of the internationally recognized Act One program for Christian storytellers in Hollywood, co-writer of the feature film Fatima, and a member of the board of directors for the Catholic Art Institute. Barbara has spent decades working at the intersection of faith, story, and culture, helping form artists and writers to engage the modern world with intelligence and beauty. We're also honored to welcome Father Damian Ference, priest of the Archdiocese of Cleveland, philosopher, author, and vicar for evangelization, whose writing frequently explores the relationship between faith, culture, literature, and beauty. Father Damian is also a lifetime member of the Flannery O'Connor Society and has written extensively on O'Connor's work and modernity. This conversation also serves as a prelude to our upcoming retreat for artists, where participants will spend time reflecting not only on Flannery O'Connor's prayer journal, but also the writings of St. Teresa of Ávila and the interior life of the artist. Thank you both so much for being with us today. And with that, I'll gladly turn this over to Barbara to begin the conversation with Father Damian.
Good. Thank you, Kathleen, and welcome, Father. We are very honored to have you and your expertise here for our community. And as Kathleen noted, this will primarily be for our artists who are going to be on retreat, and the retreat is going to look at spiritual metaphors in the work of Teresa of Ávila and Flannery O'Connor. So that seems to be shaping up as what the retreat's going to be doing. But I got the idea because this work is still not very well known, the prayer journal. It is among Flannery aficionados, but among most people out there, they aren't aware of this work at all. And so I'm very happy to especially make our artists aware of it, because I think that the things she's wrestling with are what most of them who are artists of faith, and particularly Catholics, are wrestling with. It's quite extraordinary, actually, how often I meet with artists and they say things and I'm like, wow, that's right out of the prayer journal. So anyway, I think that it will be very beautiful for our community to be introduced to this work. So in that light, Father, if you could just give us a kind of a quick kind of a 411, what was the prayer journal? Where did it come from? How did we find it? And, just to kind of give people some context.
So the prayer journal was published in 2013. It was found a few years before that, and I believe it was Bill Sessions, and he was with Flannery O'Connor's first cousin, Miss Louise Florencourt, God rest her. I knew both of those folks, and O'Connor's archive was stored in a storage unit off, I think it's 411 there in Milledgeville, and going through, one of them found a notebook that turns out to be the prayer journal that O'Connor wrote when she was working on her Master of Fine Arts at Iowa from ages of 20 to 22, I think from January 46 to September 47. And so it was of great interest to O'Connor scholars. In fact, there was a O'Connor symposium or conference in Chicago. It was either in 2012 or 2013. And at the dinner that night, Bill Sessions read the entire prayer journal. And this was a few months before it was officially published, maybe a year before. So it was exciting because, of course, O'Connor died August 3rd, 1964. And she certainly had some things published after she had died, like Mystery and Manners and Habit of Being. But this coming out, 40 years after that was a pretty big deal. And so it was published in 2013. And what's nice about the book is that you have her her actual, like, the mimeograph of what her handwriting looked like near the back end. It's not that long. I think it's 41 pages in total, but it gives us insight into
Mhm.
what O'Connor was thinking about and
Mhm.
praying about during her early 20s as a graduate student working on a Master of Fine Arts degree. And there's a lot to be said about this particular short but important work.
I when I was working on my doctorate, I was reading the unpublished letters between Flannery and her mother, and they had like 700 of them at Emory. And there was one where she was saying, I'm going to take a writing course because she went, as I understand it, she went to Iowa to study being an animator.
Yeah,
She wanted, yes, she was going to be a cartoonist.
cartoon.
But she said, I have to take a writing class, so I'm going to take a writing class in this program, which is supposed to be one of the best in the world. I hope I don't disgrace the family. And then a month later, like the end of September, there's a letter. She says to her mother, I'm not going to be disgracing the family. And then in January, she writes, I'm the best one here. And,
Yeah.
I think that she's very young, and yet she had a sense right away of what great writing was, and she's like, I can do this. So that realization, though, I think taps into one of her biggest spiritual worries, which is pride, right? And the problem of kind of realizing, not, I mean, in O'Connor's case, I think, she's one of the best ever who did what she's trying to do, and but she kind of comes to figure that out pretty fast. She's got this incredible gift, and can you talk about that? Or just react to that? That the prayer journal is it's dealing with both things. Like, I have this gift from God which I want to use, and I'm really good at this, but I don't want to lose my soul. With
Right.
ego. Mhm.
Yeah, I think it is a great presentation of what we call the Catholic both and those two things need to be held in tension and to do them well. So she wants to be an excellent artist, an excellent writer, and she has all the gifts to do that. And at the same time, she wants to be an excellent Catholic, as she
Mhm.
has been. She's a devout woman, but
Mhm.
there are not many models in the tradition of people who do both of those things well. Like, if you think, what saints were also excellent artists?
Right. Yeah.
I know Fra Angelico was beatified, right? And I think
Right.
he's buried at Santa Maria sopra Minerva, where Catherine of Siena's body is in Rome. But I can't think of, like, Caravaggio certainly wasn't a saint, and
Certainly wasn't a
Michelangelo
saint.
wasn't a saint.
He was a
And
murderer. Yeah.
right. And a lot of the great artists were
Mhm.
not saints. And so I do think that was her desire. She did not want to water down her
Mhm.
Catholicism, but she also did not want to water down her art.
Mhm.
And she knew that what she was doing was going to look different and would be misunderstood, but she wanted to both be a great artist and a great Catholic at the same time. Now, I
Mhm.
think she did it. I think she
Mhm.
did it, but not without struggle and without a lot of pain and a lot of suffering. But I think
Yeah.
that's my understanding of what's at the heart of this prayer journal. Trying to do both those things at once, and you get too cocky, too arrogant, too prideful, then you're not going to be serving your maker. You may make some good art, but she wanted both of those things and to do them well, and to do that well is hard.
And say something about the fact that I've been in higher ed for 25 years. I've taught many, many students and grad students in art, and um, I've never met any of them that had this kind of sophisticated concern about the spiritual issues that would come from having talent. And like, I never see that in my students. And so it says something extraordinary about her at the age of 20, 21, that she's brooding over this and writing about it. Don't you think, Father?
I do. I agree with you. And I also think, although it's not explicit here, I just think she was exceptionally mature for her age, having lost her father when her dad died when she was 15 years old. Um, And although she wasn't sick yet, I just think she went through a tremendous amount of suffering. Because from what I understand from her biography, her father understood her art much more than her mother did. And I think she had a friend and a confidant and someone who understood what she was trying to do there. And she would even draw him pictures and he'd keep them in his wallet and all that sort of thing. So there was something about her because she had already been at death's door with her dad and experienced tremendous suffering. I think the faith that she was practicing was not perfunctory in any way. It affected her life. It affected her art. It affected the way that she thought about things, and it made its way into the way that she understood her vocation as an artist. And here, I want to be a good artist. I want to publish. I want to do these things, and I don't want to be caught up in the psychology and the atheism and the traps that are present on the campus and in the secular university. But I also don't want to build a wall up around myself and not be part of the artistic culture. She's trying to do both those things together. And I mean, this is probably why you like her so much and why I like her so much because, yeah, like, please, thank you for being a model for me, even
Yeah.
as a priest, and I certainly have an artistic heart. I look to her and say, it can be done, you know?
Yeah, it can be. And that it's um that desire to be great doesn't have to be pride. It
Right.
can just be, I want to give God back something worthy of the gifts he's given me. And it seems to me that that's her. She's a little worried, because she does know she's really good. And there's several letters where she says to her mother, "When I read my story," she goes, "When everybody else reads their stories, we have these long discussions. When I read my stories, everybody's like quiet,
Yeah.
and she knew that was a good thing. Like she
Right.
knew that that was because she was doing something completely other. Having said that, yeah, so the idea of beautiful work for us as artists, this isn't elitism. This is not kind of being thinking you're better than other people or setting yourself above, and I think to hear that voice of her saying, I want to be a saint and I want to be a fantastic writer. I want to be the best writer I can be.
Yeah. I think actualizing all her potential, her God-given potential, and giving that back is an important part of understanding the prayer journal. She has been given great gifts. She wants to offer those back to God as her gift. And, to speak in the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, she wants to be virtuous,
Mhm.
right? It becomes second nature. She's so good at her craft and she's practicing it so hard. Even like her daily discipline of writing 4 hours a day, or when she got sick, 3 or 2 hours a day. And she didn't even stop on Sundays
Yeah.
after she went to mass and she did her prayers because this was she saw this as her vocation and she wanted to be great at it, not
Mhm.
simply for the sake of being a great artist, but for glorifying God by the gifts that he had given her. And
Mhm.
although she never saw the Second Vatican Council complete, like the call of the lady in the Second Vatican Council is be great at what you do wherever you're doing it. So it's not write, nice stories about Catholics. It is write excellent stories about reality and grace, like draw good narratives, and you glorify God in doing that, in being great at what you're called to do well. And she did that.
She does. And I think there's also the when you read Habit of Being, which is her letters collected by her, Sally Fitzgerald, her best friend, and but she has a lot of the letters are to her editors. There's a good number, and she will quibble over you took a comma out on page
Right.
17
Mhm.
that needs to go back,
Yeah.
and but that would be the kind of thing that from an editor's perspective, because I've been both an editor and a writer, that would be like, oh, here's a really difficult writer insisting on that they can their work is perfect, and but
Right.
uh but that, and in some people that's just ostentatious, and it's it's almost ridiculous. But in O'Connor's case, she became aware very fast, I think, that she was working at a level that most people didn't really know what she was doing,
Right.
including in the church. I mean, could you say something about the way the church greeted O'Connor when, her work and and how they reacted to it? The people that should have said, "Oh my gosh, it's going to take us 100 years to figure out where she's left us," in terms of literature in the church. Instead, most of them, I've read Catholic high schools banning her work,
Yes. Yeah.
so,
So,
but yeah.
well, it's interesting. For Lent, I did a book study with my young adults here. We did a different O'Connor story every Wednesday night during Lent. And at first, the young adults were having a hard time figuring out what she was doing. They knew there was something that there what was good there, but it took a while to figure out exactly what she was doing. And I like to equate Flannery O'Connor to the Catholic Mass or to baseball. And that is this. If you never knew anything about the Catholic Mass or baseball and you went to a nice, beautiful liturgy or a Major League Baseball game, even if you didn't understand everything that was going on, you would know something important was happening. And you would watch even those people who were engaged, like I want more of this because there's something good here. But I think people who were expecting her to write pious stories about priests and nuns, they missed that. But she says that she was writing for the people who don't believe in God.
Right. Yeah.
And yes, those are the atheists that are in the literary world and on campus. But remember, she also said that nihilism is the air we breathe inside and outside of the church. And I think when she said inside of the church, there are many who were within the church and perhaps still are who may be going through the motions. But if you really push, do they really believe in the God that they profess? And I think a good example of that would be the grandmother in A Good Man's Hard to Find when she says maybe
Yeah.
Jesus we didn't raise from the dead.
Yeah.
Uh, so she's challenging all those. If you think of the prodigal son story, yeah, the guy who's kind of run off and is super far away, but even the son who's been there, but not really in relationship with the father. And I think she had the tendency to be tempted to be both of those people because the secular literary world was very attractive, and then you know being the kind of pharisaical type, the self-righteous type is attractive. So to be in the place where you are in the heart of the Father's love and living out in relationally the sacramental life, where you are putting your gifts on the table every day for God because He's given Himself to you every day in the Eucharist, that's where it's at. And that's a lot of work to stay there because you're not in control of your life then, and God is. And I think as an artist, she was constantly trying to give over that control. And, her desk was her cross, and she was working hard at her craft. But I don't, yeah, she certainly could have been tempted toward pride, and I think was. But I think she was keeping herself in check and holding that balance that's so hard to hold, I think.
Mhm. So that some things you said there, I want to segue into the relationship that Flannery O'Connor has with God that kind of comes through. It's the subtext of the prayer journal is uh, her kind of absolute belief that God is aware of her, and that she was intentional, and that his gifts to her were targeted and for a purpose. And I mean,
Mhm.
she's doing her work very much in God's eyes, it seems to me, and that informs not only her work, but it says just a huge amount about her spiritual life. Can you say, would you agree with that? Or,
I do. And I think her writing and the way that she talks to God is so human and so personal, and it's so 20th century too.
Mhm.
Even in some of the references that she has, and she talks about the struggles she's going through in the classroom, or that the Monsignor said this, or I want to be this, and I'm struggling with that. I also like the way that she talks about Our Lady. Early on in the journal, it's Our Lady of Perpetual Help, but then as the journal moves on, it becomes My Lady of Perpetual Help, even more personal.
Yeah.
And I think it's a, a great a great honor and a great experience to be able to kind of listen in. It's like reading Augustine's Confessions because you're hearing her in her voice talk to God, how she talks to God. Now, this is from her early 20s. Who knows how that prayer life developed, but I'm convinced it only got better and deeper as she got older. But that we have this, it's a little gem.
Mm-hmm. And I think that so key for our artists to see their work as something that they're doing for God, for first and foremost, because it's the only thing I think that will help you stay at it. Because it's such a thankless thing most of the time. Being an artist, you're
Yes.
alone, you're underpaid, you're dealing with idiots who don't appreciate what you're giving them. You're constantly having to try to sell yourself, and it's a very hard life to live. I look at O'Connor, her
Yes.
own mother,
Right.
didn't like her work, and she had to. I think there's a line where she says they passed my book around in a brown paper bag among the women of Milledgeville.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but that idea of but if you're working for God, and if that, then now you stay at it. It doesn't really matter what the world says or what even your own
Right.
family says. And
Right.
so that I mean, I think that becomes, for me, it's one of the key things to believe and really and put faith in. God gave you these gifts. He has he knows what you're doing.
Yes.
Um and he's going to say to you someday, why didn't you paint more, or
Yeah.
why didn't you write more?
Yeah.
And just saying, well, because my mom didn't like my work, it isn't going
Right.
to cut it.
Yeah. She's not afraid of rejection. Even you mentioned the habit of being in her letters. It's within there that she says, I save all my rejection letters.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I did that and I do that because of O'Connor. And I
Mhm.
think that's great because if you're waiting for every person to understand you perfectly as an artist, you're done. Like that's never going to happen. But if you're giving your best and God is understanding you and he's put a few good friends in your life who also understand you, that's such a gift. And even to go
Mhm.
back to the editing business, it is true that she could be a little stubborn and saying, no, I want this comma, I want it this way. But she was also very docile to Carolyn Gordon, her friend,
Mhm.
who she would give manuscripts to. And Carolyn would say, no, you've got to do this or think of this better. So if she trusted you and thought, you were helping her in her craft, she would take all that advice and incorporate that in. So she had close artist friends who she counted on to give her good, honest criticism to make her art better. And she was sending out drafts of things to friends and asking their opinions often. And sometimes she would take the advice, other times she wouldn't. And that's a matter of prudence and discernment. But
Mhm.
I think she was praying through all that too.
I think she was. And I think that to me, the second thing about the relationship with God is one is, as an artist, it will keep you at it. But number two, that we see, she says in one prayer in the prayer journal, help me to get down under things.
Yeah.
I'm
Mhm.
not quite saying it right, but it's like help me to write well and to get down under. And
Mhm.
that says to me, if you expect to do work that is going to be more profound spiritually, especially, and have a spiritual power, you're not going to do that if God is not the one showing you the way.
Right. Here, give me the grace, dear God, to see the bareness and the misery of the places where you are not adored but desecrated.
Mm,
So she can't do that on her own. She
yeah.
needs his help to get into those places and to see things with her art with her artist's eyes in order to present these kind of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had that experience myself as an artist, as screenwriter. There have been times when, I just don't know what to do. I don't know how to solve a problem. I'm absolutely stuck. And what I've learned is I'll go to church and I'll sit in the church and pray and try to not, but in my work, you got to get the pages in on a certain
Right.
day, but anyway, and it would be invariably that it would come to me a day or two later, even
Mhm.
driving home. And I really learned that lesson that the best stuff that came out of me came from beyond me. And I
Yeah.
think O'Connor's already figured that out at 20, uh,
Yes.
which
Now,
which is
I would add to that. I think her writing discipline is very closely connected to her obedience and her faithfulness because she'll jump on friends who say, I want to be a writer. And she's like, well, what are you doing? When are you carving this time out? Do not do anything else. Sit there for these hours and get this done and be faithful to that time. When I was writing my dissertation in Rome, I followed O'Connor's schedule, except I took off on Sundays. But every day after I prayed and had breakfast in the morning, 9 to noon, I wrote. And some days I wrote 3 or 4 or 5 pages, and other days I barely got a couple sentences in. But I knew if I was faithful to what I was asked to do, that I did my job for that day. And some days I wanted to keep writing, but I said, no, 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 I could pick up tomorrow. And other days I was just so glad I was done. But I think being faithful to what you've been called to do, even if you don't see a lot of the fruits then, it's like Simone Weil used to say, just go go through it and and trust that that affliction is actually working on you to make you a better artist too. So there's something about staying disciplined, not simply waiting for inspiration, but being there disciplined. So when that inspiration comes, you are there to catch it. You are there to work with it when God speaks, you know?
so so if you had to kind of just, synthesize what we've been saying here, what would you say is like the keynote of Flannery O'Connor's relationship with God, but her understanding of herself and God? Like how would you say that the journal kind of fills that in for us? Because in her stories, um, it's there, but it's not. I mean, once you read the journal, you can see it, but
Yeah.
but this is like a whole other revelation of what she thinks about God and us. I mean, how would you answer that?
Yeah. Well, there is that one line in there. It'll take me a couple of minutes to find it, but it's something like, I want to be God's typewriter.
Yeah.
I think that's a wonderful
Yeah.
image to consider
Mhm.
because what does that mean? It's, like St. Francis saying, make me your instrument, use me, use my gifts for your glory. So it's very Marian in the
Mhm.
sense that she's open to receiving what God wants to do with her, but it also takes her yes, her fiat, her cooperation with of all her gifts with God. So needs to be an intentionality on her part that she is cooperating with God's grace.
Mhm.
So I think there's a Marian theme running underneath this.
That's fantastic. And now you kind of segued perfectly into what I want to talk about next, was grace. And so Flannery O'Connor's work in Mystery and Manners, she says basically it all comes down to the moment of grace. That
Hmm.
and she says it's not necessary for your character to accept the moment of grace, but it's absolutely essential as a storyteller that they have one. That's
Yes,
what
yes,
story is somebody kind of, and of course her characters, she makes them suffer terribly as a way of breaking them open to that moment of grace, and she
right.
says that. But yeah, what is grace for Flannery O'Connor, and what does the journal add to that?
Okay, hold on. I just need to grab my copy of this is why I sat here and not across the street in my office because I can give you her definition of grace, which is it's excellent. And it starts out grace to the Catholic way of thinking, and then I have to complete it here, but I'll get it. Just give me a second. Let's see. I think it's 386. I may be wrong. But yeah, that's at the heart of her. Okay, here it is. It's on 389 of Have to Be. Grace to the Catholic way of thinking can and does use as its medium the imperfect, the purely human, and even the hypocritical.
Mhm.
So that's why oftentimes when someone's head is so hard, she'll say that an act of violence isn't done for the act of violence, but to wake them up to see that something isn't what they thought it was, and
Mhm.
that it opens their mind and heart to receive this this power that God is bestowing that allows for one's transformation, for one's a change of life, a conversion, um, going from blindness to sight, from deafness to hearing, from not being able to see to finally being able to see, you know?
Mhm.
So, and we could go through different stories, but you ask, how does the prayer journal highlight or amplify what we already know about the grace? Is that when she's writing in the prayer journal, she's asking God for the grace in her own life to be able to do the kind of things that she wants to do. And it's that same grace that she wants to show in her characters. And by the way, very few of O'Connor's characters are likable at all. They're all like
Yes.
you wouldn't want to be friends with hardly any of them. Maybe Father Flynn or something, but maybe not even him.
No.
Uh, because what she's showing is the fallen world, and that God is breaking into the fallen world with His grace to save us, to redeem us, and offer us something that we can't get on our own. So, um, I guess the connection between these two books, or her prayer journal and her fiction, or her letters in her life, is that it's the same grace that was at work in her life, that she experienced herself, that she was bringing or inviting in or showing, was at work in her characters too, because of God's love for all those characters. You know?
and and it's kind of giving God permission to, break her a little bit as grace, because
Yes.
that's what happens to almost all of her characters. They have to have a trauma, and that cuts through their sense of self, their sense of, being okay. And you think about the grandmother in a Good Man's Hard to Find. It takes a gun in her face
Right.
and and her family being murdered for her to finally go, oh, you're one of my babies, like
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
it's like. And so it's like, too bad somebody wasn't there to put a gun in her face every day of her
Right.
life. But I think O'Connor is saying that for most of us, it requires our pride to be broken through by failure, by being really wrong about something, and
Right.
that's extremely Aristotelian when you talk about the Poetics, where he says the most powerful story is going to be the one where somebody, who they're not evil, but they fail through ignorance or petty, petty things, or folly. And then they have to realize, oh, I'm not as smart as I thought I was, and
Yeah.
that's the heart of storytelling from Aristotle. And I think O'Connor internalizes that, but I love that she's saying to God, and she may not yet even appreciate what she's asking, because she's
Right.
so young, and she's going to figure out in her story that that's her thing, I think. But in her stories, but still, it's giving God permission to break me. That's what I'm asking
Right.
for.
Well,
Yeah.
two, this book was written when she was in 20 to 22, and it wasn't until she was 25 that she was diagnosed with the same disease that killed her father, lupus, which eventually took her. And I find it fascinating that when she went to Lourdes with her mother, and it was the Diocese of Savannah at the time, on pilgrimage in 1958, she did go into the baths, but she did not pray for her healing. She prayed for her writing,
Mm.
because I think she embraced the cross that was given to her, and in a weird, strange Catholic Flannery O'Connor way, that sickness that she received was a strange grace, which allowed her 14 years on a farm to be writing some of the best fiction that's ever been written in the United States, if not the world. But she was going through terrible suffering at the time, and she did not feel abandoned by God. Somehow she was taking all that. She may have, cried out at times like, God, where are you? But I don't think she ever fell into despair. I don't think we have any evidence of that. That she was a faithful artist, even through and especially through her suffering. And it was through her suffering in many ways that so much of her work emerged.
Mhm.
So
I think also, one of the other sufferings that you can see, like I say, I read those 700 letters that she wrote home. And one of the things that happens while she's in graduate school, I believe, is she realizes she comes from a racist family and that she
Yep.
herself has internalized some of that. And because when you read even the letters she wrote in high school when she was traveling in Boston, New York, she wrote back to her mother. There's definite racism there.
Yeah.
It's kind of like this black girl sat down next to me, and thought like she belonged there.
Mhm.
But I think that when she gets to graduate school and she actually meets a poet who's a woman of color and really admires her work, and but then has to kind of go, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
my whole family is steeped in this. And so that becomes one of her big themes is the inner brain of people who just think they're right about, in this case, race, and they're
Right.
wrong. And
Hmm.
she shows you. But I've had people be incensed at her for depicting the racist in their own context. And as she says, everybody has a grandmother like that. Everybody has an aunt or an uncle. But I do think that for her was a suffering. It was a humiliation to realize that I come from this world, and it's really wrong, about this. But that was a grace for her.
Yeah. Those letters, some of them, I don't know if all of them, but they were collected in a little book called Dear Regina. And I read it last year, the letters between O'Connor and her mother. And she had the African American woman in her class, and she told her mom, and her mom was kind of upset. And then she was defending. She's like, no, she's really wonderful, and get to meet her. So you see that she's growing, she's learning, and again, recognizing her own sinfulness, her own blind spots, which is what she's showing in her fiction. Again, that it's a grace, and it is painful to admit, oh man, I didn't even see this about myself. I'm embarrassed about it, but I'm grateful that I see it now. And then, of course, she wanted to address that in her fiction, and that's a whole nother podcast or interview or retreat. But uh, I think she's excellent at it. I think she was well aware of the culture she was raised in, um, and she was addressing it well as a Catholic too, not simply politically, but as a Catholic and as an artist.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Because she says, in Mystery and Manners, that the key is you have to write from your country. You have to know what your country is, and you have to write from that place. And she's not only talking about, I come from, the deep South and Georgia, but as a Catholic, you
Mhm.
have to know what our country is. And so I think that idea of her um putting those two things together and say, I come from these two countries, and but it's going to make my work real if I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I'm going to depict it as
Right,
it is, both things.
right.
So I think that's, for me, when she's asking God for the courage to get down under stuff, I think it's because she's realizing that.
That's great.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
So we got to end here. We're we've kind of hit our top. But anything you would like to say, kind of any if you were pointing people towards the journal, like especially our artists, give them a pitch of why they should read this work, Father.
I think it reminds artists of the importance of prayer and actually taking the time, not just, rattling off an Our Father or saying that I went to Mass, and you should do both of those things, certainly, but that she took the time to journal her thoughts down and was actually writing to God. Um, that that was a part of her craft, and allowed her to be who she was going to be. And I think that although we don't have God's answer here, we do see that God was answering her prayers in her fiction, and the way that um she was able to show God's grace. And there are many people who have come to faith by reading O'Connor, and not just the prayer journal, but her fiction. But we realized that what she was doing, this is a whole circle back to the beginning of our conversation, she was both devout and she was a great artist at the same time. And you didn't get to this question, but I do want to say this. There were some folks who thought it was unnecessary to publish this within the academy, like we didn't need to know all this, and we should just don't take O'Connor as her stories are. I
Mhm.
mean, sure, you can do that, but it's also nice to know what was going on in people's heads and hearts and what they were thinking and know some biography. And to have someone's own prayers is super helpful to understand the woman who I think, yes, outstanding artist, saint, novelist, but also a dynamite Catholic. And I think
Yeah.
a model for any artist who wants to love God and be a great artist at the same time. We get something here that I don't think we get anywhere else.
No. And I've actually, when I was reading it several times, I thought, I wonder what Flannery would think about this being published because, it's just so unguarded and it's so, yeah, she wanted her to be looked at through her work. Having said that, she was pretty open in the speeches she gave and the things she wrote about writing. And, but anyway, I think, I did think that like sometimes I was just like, oh, it's too personal, but it
Yeah.
was encouraging. It's very encouraging. It's like, oh, she's a human being.
Yeah, and speaking of human being, the last entry, I remember when Bill Sessions read this out loud at that conference. She says, "My thoughts are so far away from God, he might as well not have made me." Like, who hasn't felt like that before, right? And the
Yeah.
feeling I egg up writing here lasts approximately a half hour and seems a sham. And who hasn't had that? I
Mhm.
don't want any of this artificial, superficial feeling stimulated by the choir. And then she ends with this: "Today, I have proved myself a glutton. For Scotch, oatmeal cookies, and erotic thought, there is nothing left to say of me." And I remember when Bill read it, I didn't know if it was Scotch, comma, oatmeal cookies, and erotic thought, or if it was Scotch oatmeal cookies. And sure enough, it's a kind of oatmeal cookie called Scotch
Yeah.
oatmeal cookies.
That's
And I
really
had
good.
them last year when I was in Georgia. But I think that's it's so human of her, and
Mhm.
and it gives us permission to say, I can talk like God did, like I could talk to God that way too. And when I feel like I'm terrible and I failed, what does she do with that? She takes it to him.
Yeah.
She
Nope.
doesn't turn in on herself. She tells him about that. And I
Yeah.
think that's wonderful.
I think it is too. I think that there's no pretension between Flannery O'Connor and God, and to me, that's like getting close to really the height of holiness. If you can get rid of all that stuff. So,
Yeah.
and she's 22 and she's doing that. So, anyway, Father, thank you so much. Kathleen, did you want to throw anything in there, or
Just to say thank you very much for this rich conversation. And it's interesting all the parallels that can be drawn from her struggles and for those of us that are artists that struggle with the very same thing, it's really helpful to examine this. We're not alone when we're suffering and struggling with these things, and so it's been enriching to hear more about this, and happy that we're going to be able to explore this even more depth, on the weekend of our retreat in June. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you so much, both of you, for
Great.
this.
yes,
You're
thank you,
welcome.
Father.
Thanks
We're
for
so
the
happy
invitation.
to have met you. You have to come and talk to our artists at some point.
I would love to. Yeah, give me a little more advance notice and I'll be there.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. God bless.
All right. God bless you,
Bless
Father.
you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.